Tonight on Newshour, Uganda has announced it's negotiating a new round of funding with the International Monetary Fund after a previous one lapsed last year. It comes at a time when a number of African countries are also locked in negotiations with the IMF. From Kampala to Kinshasa, from Dar es Salaam to Accra, government officials are trying to balance the benefits of funding stability with the often strict rules of repayment. Well, Uganda is pushing for a new facility to help the government steady an economy experiencing surging levels of debt. Meanwhile, in Tanzania, leaders are weighing reforms that could unlock billions, but might also risk domestic discontent. And in the resource-rich Democratic Republic of Congo, IMF support has become the gateway to wider international financing, whilst also raising some uncomfortable questions about sovereignty and control. Now, the IMF says that for partnerships to truly stabilise economies and create the conditions for prosperity, rules need to be rigorous, conditions need to be serious and realistic. But critics question whether global institutions should ever possess the power to de facto dictate domestic policies. Well, tonight we explore how much leverage the fund really has, whether African governments feel boosted by the IMF's helping hand or restricted by its tight grip, and what all this means for nations already struggling with inflation and debt. We start in Uganda, where the government is seeking a fresh IMF facility as public debt continues to climb. The question now is how far conditions will reach into domestic policy. Our correspondent Michael Beleke in Kampala has this report.
Uganda's government says it's negotiating a new loan with the IMF to help cover its budget shortfall. The last deal, worth about $1 billion, expired last year, but only $870 million reached the government coffers after what the IMF called implementation challenges. Officials now say a new program is being drawn up, but it will not go to the IMF board until after the country's presidential and parliamentary elections early next year. Timing matters. With campaigns underway, decisions on critical funding hang in a balance, along with Uganda's swelling debt. Public debt climbed nearly 18% last year to more than $29 billion, over half of the country's GDP. The government is under pressure to find cheap financing, and the IMF is one of the few options. Critics see the IMF flexing its muscle, lending only when a country is short on cash, then demanding policy changes in return. Others say these loans are a vital lifeline Uganda can't afford to refuse. Here in Kampala, the debate is clear. Uganda needs the money, but at what cost? And as the negotiations continue, many are asking, is this aid or influence disguised as finance? Michael Beleke for News in Kampala.
Next to Tanzania, a country weighing reforms tied to IMF support. Officials there argue the fund's backing is essential for stability, but there are growing concerns over the social cost. From Dar es Salaam, Isaac Lukandu has this report.
In late June, the International Monetary Fund approved $448 million in loans to Tanzania, a vote of confidence in the country's economic reforms. The funds come under two arrangements, the Extended Credit Facility and the Resilience and Sustainability Facility. The IMF praised Tanzania's recent economic performance. GDP grew 5.5% last year and is expected to hit 6% this year. Inflation is low, under 5%, and the monetary policy is considered stable, with the exchange rate guided by market forces. The fund also noted that the banking sector remains solid, though some vulnerabilities persist. But it wasn't all praises. The IMF warned of risks from global uncertainty, declining aid flows, and potential delays in the implementation of reforms. To keep growth on track, it urged the government to speed up reforms, monitor budget spending closely, and strengthen the private sector. For Tanzania, the IMF backing is a welcome boost, but the challenge now is turning that support into lasting economic momentum. Isaac Lukando for A News in Dar es Salaam.
And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, leaders are looking to IMF approval as a gateway to foreign investment. For Kinshasa, credibility with international lenders may prove just as important as cash. Our correspondent Chris Okamringa in the capital reports now.
The International Monetary Fund announced the payment of the $261 million loan to the Democratic Republic of Congo earlier this year to enhance the DRC's capacity to engage effectively in international trade. The bank's executive board acknowledged the progress that the DRC had made in financial reforms, particularly in issues of transparency and the implementation of a Treasury single account. The account is an important tool for managing government transactions and minimizing borrowing. The DRC's economy has been hit hard by the M23 conflict that began in late 2021 in the country's east. The government has spent heavily in buying military equipment and lost a lot of revenue from taxes in mining sites controlled by the rebels. The IMF loan will help strengthen its foreign exchange reserves, but some analysts have been calling on the government to carry out reforms in the best interests of the Congolese people, warning that the IMF loans come with strings attached. They cited a 2009 case where the IMF put pressure on the DRC government to renegotiate a $9 billion infrastructure for minerals deal it signed with the Chinese consortium. Many observers saw it as a direct challenge to the IMF's dominance of international development finance. Chris Okamringa for A News, Kinshasa.
Well, for a more in-depth look at this, I'm joined now by Silvanus Karemera, an international broadcaster, senior editor in Kigali, Rwanda. Silvanus, thank you very much for joining us. Good to see you there. From your vantage point then, when you are in Rwanda, how is the IMF shaping politics across the region?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think from the Rwanda's vantage point, the IMF has been in good terms with Rwanda. If I look at the tracing, economic partnership and everything related to economic point of view, Rwanda as a country has been able to maintain stability in relationship with IMF, which is quite different from neighboring countries that have, as we have just heard from our colleagues in Kinshasa, Kampala, and Dar es Salaam. Even in Kenya, if you remember last year, we have some riots and demonstrations in Nairobi because of the some of the policies that the government had been initiating to, do with the hiking the price and so on and so forth. So you can see the IMF, funds and the grants and the debts and so on and so forth has been impacting the political and economic growth in this region. But speaking, as you asked, Rwanda has adopted a pragmatic approach to its relationship with the IMF because, frankly speaking, and for quite some time, the country has utilized IMF programs to strengthen its economic reforms, focusing on areas such as tax policy, and fiscal transparency. And Rwanda's commitment to these reforms has been recognized by IMF, which to some point has provided technical assistance to support the country's development objectives. So I would say that to some point, because of the investment that has been, put down by the government in fighting the corruption and grafts in a wide range of areas, IMF has to some point been bestowing confidence in Rwanda, which is to some point, as I said earlier, is quite different from other countries. So I would say that the IMF influence in East African countries is to some point multifaceted, because it affects political landscapes in both direct and indirect ways. Much as the IMF is trying to give some support in trainings, in financial support, in technical assistance, and the policy, but we have seen some variations when it comes to countries of this region.
And let's just move to Uganda now for a moment. One of the countries hitting the headlines on this story in the last 48 hours. They're asking, in simple terms, for more money. Does this reveal financial fragility or political over-reliance?
Well, I think this is depending on how people view it and look at it, because I mean, it's not about Uganda alone. It's about all African countries, or if you like, the developing countries. Because if you remember, way back in 2021, Uganda had borrowed about of actually 870 million from IMF. Today, they go back to asking for about 500. 60 million US dollars. And remember, Uganda is having both parliamentary and presidential election in next year. So some of people, actually including myself, view this move as one that is trying to secure these funds, not only for development agenda, but also to some point, try to fund this election that is coming up. But this is, again, pose some questions and some grievances, because if you look at the the debt, public debt with Uganda and the IMF, you see to some point the public debt has been rising. If you look at for example, the statistics from last year 2024 to today, about 70%, 17% has been has been hiked, so to say, has been coming up. Which is approximately over 52% of GDP, rising from 49.9 last year. So you see, the question here and the issue here is not about whether or not they're going to invest. It's about, does this money that is coming from IMF is going to be, solving the intended purpose which the government has been putting forward. So I would say that it's tricky to me. It's tricky because going by history, even the money that has been borrowed before has, to some point, and according to the statistics and the economic perspective and economic analysis, has not to some point been able to, respond to the need on the ground, especially to do with creating jobs and attending to the grievances from the youthful people who actually make the big proportion of Uganda's, Uganda and Africa as a whole, or even the region that we are in.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point you make about the forthcoming election in Uganda and the impact of that on this issue. I mean, in Tanzania, two reforms seem to be stirring debate, arguments, different perspectives. How risky are some of these IMF demands for political stability, do you think?
Yeah, it's well, you cannot say it's risky. But maybe you can say it's kind of a discontent that is emerging between parts. IMF is trying to impose some of the strings when it is giving out these grants or funds or debt, whatever you may call it. But again, in the government, I mean, from the government side, which is the borrower, it's trying to maintain some of the what I could say local. Directives, so to say. So there have been these discrepancies and misunderstanding because, for example, you spoke about Tanzania. If you look at Tanzania today, leading up to October presidential election and the parliamentary elections, there have been some stories emerging from there. The government and other, institutions have been blamed for stifling maybe what we call the freedom of speech, activists trying to be taken to court and so on and so forth. So this is something that IMF has always been talking about. And the tricky point of it is how the government is trying to navigate through this to secure this fund so that Patre is going to support or to fund the election in Tanzania. So I would say that Tanzania has been experiencing this steady economic growth for the last one or so decades. You see some strings, financial strings, that is attached to the money that Tanzania is looking for, which to me, I don't know what is going to happen because much as discussions going on we see some misunderstanding, which to some point is not there, is not public. So I would say the future and the attainment of these negotiations, to me, is still very grim.
If you look at the case of Kinshasa, you see both sides of this story, don't you? They rely on IMF approval to attract much more investment internationally. So we see the positive effect, the multiplier effect of that initial IMF approval. But at the same time, there are question marks about sovereignty and control. Where is the public on this issue?
Well, the problem is on both sides, to my understanding, because, I mean, the question with Kinshasa is not that one I've just mentioned with Tanzania, with Uganda, and even with Kenya, if you like. For example, if you look at what Kinshasa government or the country as a whole is going through, it's very challenging. Part of the eastern part of the country is already in the hands of rebels, AFC-M23, and that's how the government has not been able to control. So you can even wonder, the money that is being given to Kinshasa, which is, over $260 million US from the IMF, is it going to support the whole country, or is it going to be partial? In this case, supporting one part of the. That is number one. But number two, analysts believe that actually the money that is being given to Kinshasa government or secured from the IMF is not necessarily going to be responding to what is happening on the ground. It's going to be ending in buying some, let's say, weapons to fight the rebels. Now, this is with what is happening on the ground, where, for example, the good governance, the collection of revenues, people and companies and stuff. Let's say from the local sources of collecting money is not functional to some point. And if you remember, we've had some cases, even from high-ranking government officials, being taken to court because of some of the issues to do with the corruption and so on and so forth. So I would say that whether health, in this case, Kinshasa is going to negotiate and finally be given this money, whether it's not going to be possible, we still see the same problem, with the other countries in this region. So it's about deep discussions. It's about kind of a channel that is going to be, or rather should be put in place to make sure that the single coin that is being given to any government, not only in Kinshasa but also in other countries, is going to be used in a manner that has been responding to the local needs.
Silvanus, do you think more generally that African governments are too dependent still on external forces, external validation? We know that Washington, Beijing, Moscow all have tremendous interests across the continent. Many analysts still talk about the fact that the spectre of French colonialism has not been yet completely eradicated. Are you hopeful that at some point the continent can start to become more in charge of its own economic destiny?
Yeah, thank you. Yes and no. Yes, because some African countries, to some point, have been increasingly turned to the IMF. And this has often been seen as a proxy for financial legitimacy. Because if you go by history, if you go by current number, you find that at least over 20 countries, in Africa have in recent years been engaging with IMF programs, including, Kenya and other few, countries, like, for example, Zambia and Mozambique. But still, on the other side, you see some of the other countries are trying to disconnect, from, just like you said, from European dependency or from Western dependency. In this case, you could look at, for example, countries in Sahel, part of Africa, like, for example, Niger, Burkina Faso, and a few others. Just like you said, you see they're trying to disconnect from the, if I may call, former masters, now to forge or rather to, chart their ways of dependency. But again, this also has some issues because most of these countries whereas they try to disconnect from Western powers, including the U.S., Washington, so to say, and European countries. Now they opt for China and Russia and the other, other superpowers that are emerging from, especially from Asia. So when it comes to issues of dependency, to me, it's still there. Maybe what is the different from the other is maybe the difference in strings attached to these grants and funds, because just like you said, we still see some maybe countries being being directed by these superpowers to conduct their internal businesses and negotiations. So yes, because some countries have to some point been withdrawing or even trying to not go quick to make sure that they still work with the European countries, but also they have now gone back to working with other superpowers, which is to me very normal, because most of countries, like for example Rwanda, they have adopted the policy of alignment, because you cannot depend on one country without being sure of what is coming tomorrow. So I would say that this dependence is still there, although we have seen some variations when it comes to implement it, as it used to be maybe 10 to 20 to 30 years before today.
Now, finally, Silvanus, the whole point of this IMF support isn't to continue dependency indefinitely. It's to empower countries to go on and become in charge of their own economic futures, whether that is through attracting wider funding or whether it's through infrastructure development and empowering and developing the domestic economies. How hopeful are you that that can take place over the next 5, 10, 15 years? And what needs to be done to supercharge that journey to complete autonomy?
Look, it's okay. To me, it's very appalling, and I have always been trying to put this answer into very ordinary perspective, layman's perspective. It doesn't make sense to me for a continent like Africa, with over 30 million square kilometers, with immense resources, with over 60% of its soil being arable land, which has always been untapped across the globe, with governments, a continent constituted of 54 countries and plus, to always attending to these, developed countries and the financial institutions. If IMF has been there, if World Bank has been there, and to many people seem to be proxies for the superpowers, why can't Africa, and I'm trying to disconnect from now the numbers to give you a perspective of what is happening. Why can't African countries plus their presidents sit down and see what to do? And I normally give an example of a country like Germany, which is slightly the size of Uganda, having the GDP, PPP, and the other resources quite double bigger than Africa combined. So it's a language that I cannot explain here, and it's if you look at it from modern perspective, you can't understand. You don't know what is happening behind the curtain. And people have always been looking at leaders, from their conferences and from their offices, blaming the colonialists and the colonialism. And then you wonder for how long this is going to be ending. You can't always rely on blaming colonialism, which actually stopped from Africa, abolished, so to say, 60 years ago. What have you been doing? And it's not because I'm Rwandan, but I always like to give an example for Rwanda, which emerged from the ashes of genocide against the Tutsi 31 years ago, which had put just in shambles today, which has been ticking on the international media because of economic growth. So you can see the lack of political will and the political concern to make sure that Africa ultimately and eventually is emerging. And what is appalling more? You see a sense of, I'm a journalist, and I from the interviews and from an analytical perspective, you see a sense of brainy drain. You see very many youth in Africa aspiring to go living I've had these privileges to, visiting different countries in Europe and Asia. But you see African people moving now to those countries to actually do some people say undecent jobs, which otherwise you could have been doing it at home and get a return from what you are doing. So it's something that I cannot explain in this discussion for sure. It's appalling, so to say, but because of few countries that have been trying to emerge from this problem, it might take so long to, switch off from this dependence, but yes, definitely it will be achieved in near future.
Yes, well, we all hope so. And Silvanus, we thank you very much indeed for your analysis, for joining us from Kigali in Rwanda. Thank you very much indeed. And so tonight we've seen how the IMF, born as a financial stabilizer, has become a decisive force in Africa's political landscape. From Kampala to Kinshasa, governments are reshaping policy, not simply because they choose to, but because international creditors at times insist upon it. Supporters call this discipline. Critics see it as dependency. For millions of Africans, the outcome will be felt not in the boardrooms, but in household budgets and everyday struggles. Well, that is all for this edition of News Hour. From all of us here at A News, thanks for being with us.